Hello, folks. Welcome to Between Awesome and Disaster. This is your host, Will Carey. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you are doing well, finding joy in your lives, and doing things that bring you it. I'm doing the same thing as well. This particular week, oh my gosh, where to start on things I did this week. The most important thing that I've gotten to is I'm writing songs again. I finally had this one song that I've had the music and arrangement for a while, but I'm very excited to finally get some inspiration for the lyrics, as well as a potential new avenue for these original songs. So I will keep you guys updated as that process continues to evolve. I also went to two different concerts. Got to see two of my all-time favorite bands this week. Well, I guess I saw my all-time favorite band twice, and then, regardless. So Blink-182's World Tour has finally kicked off in earnest, and I was able to, and fortunate enough to get to see their shows at Madison Square Garden. This was last week, as well as their performance at Barclays Center in Brooklyn. And then I was able to see the Gaslight Anthem at the Paramount, which is out in Huntington, in Long Island. And of course, if you are going to a show at the Paramount, you need to go to I believe it is called Little Vincent's Pizzeria. I'm going to get that exact one because I would need you guys to know this. Yeah, Little Vincent's Pizza, where you can get something called a cold cheese pie, which is a cheese pizza that you then dump additional shredded cold mozzarella cheese on top of for a temperature and textural wonderment of different experiences. So that's what I have been up to. And I do apologize last week for the re-release, but for anyone who has not heard my second episode with Drew Morgan, that was a really excellent episode. And then I feel like right after that, Drew's just exploded comedy-wise. So that's really cool to see that I still had that connection with him that many years ago. But today, I'm super excited to share with you my conversation with Chris Wrenn. Chris is the founder of Bridge 9 Records, who have put out some amazing albums. He's worked with bands like Candy Hearts, Agnostic Front, H2O, very vital in and important label in the litany of East Coast hardcore music. Put out a ton of really great bands, and is a super chill and down to earth dude. I always and you'll hear me say this to him at the beginning of the interview, is that whenever I talk to folks who are very much more punk than I could ever be, because in terms of my my connection to the culture of punk rock is very much of a researcher. I was not around in the vicinity where a lot of the influential work was being done. So I've always felt like I was sort of like an archaeologist, sort of unearthing times and scenes in different areas. And Chris is a absolute fountain of knowledge for the New England and East Coast hardcore scene. And a very chill dude, very opening, very much in line with my belief of tearing down the gatekeepers and bringing everybody into the beautiful world that is punk rock music, and finding positivity and support, and the mentality of if someone falls down in the pit, you pick them up. And Chris is very much that guy, and he has supported and helped put out some great albums, and we're going to talk about them, and we're going to talk about how one starts a record label with no business experience, and how one continues to do so, and what band that is looking to get their attention, the right kind of attention, could be doing. So I feel like there's a wealth of info to be found here and to be had. So thank you all so much for being here, and let's dive right into it and talk to Chris Wrenn of Bridge 9 Records. And I talk to people that are a zillion times more punk than I could ever be, because I always feel like I could get fired from punk rock. for
No,
not being punk enough.
there's no punk scale, and anyone that thinks there is, I mean, or not that you, but like anyone that holds anyone to one is, has the wrong idea.
Oh, dude, 100%. That was something I realized like really, really kind of early on when I started getting into like this scene and then started doing like my like art punk rock like deep dive. Pretty much you start pointing out this sort of like hypocrisies in like the punk ethos of what they're rebelling against versus what they enforce and like the rules within the scene kind of shows like a real lack of self-awareness I've always found.
Yeah, I would agree.
But dude, I'm so excited to chat with you today. Not only has your label put out so many like amazing records, but I think I've interviewed one of your previous artists, Miriam from Candy Hearts.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, she was on the show a few years ago.
Nice.
So let me. I kind of want to sort of trace your through line here, leading up to today. I'm sort of curious. Do you recall, in your kind of journey of being a music fan, do you have like a specific ground zero moment from when you got introduced to punk music specifically?
So, for me, like the first record that I had, I was a child of the '80s, and there was no way for you to listen to what you wanted to unless you had physical media, right? So you had to have a cassette or a record. And the first record that I had was given to me by a cousin, and it was the Deep Purple Machine Head record. And that was kind of like a proto metal, 70s kind of, the Smoke on the Water, is like the hit. And, it was something that because it was the only thing that I had that I could just play on demand, I listened to nonstop. So I don't know if that's what kind of geared me towards an interest in music that was a little heavier than what you'd hear on the radio, but that's where it started.
Deep Purple.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I had to go back and really kind of re-examine them because like when I started playing guitar, of course everybody learns how to do dun 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 dun. But they were like, so there's so much more than that. Just that one song. I even remember like my exposure to like that era of heavy music was probably this is gonna sound really really silly, but Stone Cold Steve Austin had like basically a compilation like basically of his favorite heavy metal of the era. So it was like Kiss and Rainbow, and I remember specifically being like really grabbed by the Scorpions too when I was growing up.
When you tell me that, you know what I think is the coolest part about that though is somebody like Stone Cold Steve Austin creating a gateway for people like you to get exposed to bands like that. For me, one of the big ones that kind of directed me more towards a punk rabbit hole was probably Metallica when they did their Garage Days record. So that had a couple Misfits covers on there, and that I kind of dove down that a little bit, started to get exposed to the Misfits and other bands from that era, and might not have been on my radar, at least not for a while, had they not thought to do that.
Oh my God, yeah. I think that was the first time I heard the Misfits as well. I had Garage Inc. Because when it came out on CD, and then that's when the drummer in my high school band at the time, who was always like more with it than me, because I was like I grew up in the suburbs, and not even really the suburbs. The suburbs were like a glint in my eye. I was like from a very rural place, and the record stores we had were like Walmart and Target. So I'm there with my like na early 2000s kind of pop punk. And then he's like, no, check out this. And he starts feeding me like NoFX and Black Flag. And I learned about the Descendants because Mark Hoppus would always name check them. So 100%, like having those like almost like those sort of like I like to call them like older brother figures, even if they're like kind of placebos. That sort of like starts your kind of gateway for sure.
Well, and so a lot of people live in these not necessarily rural but suburban places where you don't necessarily have a main line into really cool hardcore punk, right? You need to find your way to it. and every once in a while there'll be somebody, if you don't have an older brother or sister or somebody that's involved in the scene in some way, that might name check something, like you said, whether it's Steve Austin or Metallica or Blink-182. I mean, there was, I found out about the Dead Kennedys because of Slayer. The guitarist would always have Dead Kennedy stickers on his guitar. So you start to kind of like dig a little deeper when things are exposed to you on like more of like a mainstream level.
Absolutely. A comparison I've made a lot of times in talking to people, maybe I wonder if you could relate to this. When I started drinking coffee, I would like load it up with cream, load it up with sugar, like whipped cream, like the sweetest kind of drink possible. And then that was like my Blink-182s, my Sum 41, Green Day. And then maybe when I start drinking just regular coffee with maybe a little milk and no sugar in it, that's like Descendants, Black Flag, the Queers, maybe Bad Brains, that kind of stuff. And then by the time you get to like Single Origin, like Pour Over, and you're doing like super like very specific like niche countries, that's when you're getting into like your Agnostic Fronts, your Madballs, Quicksand, all of that like super like DIY stuff. But it's so important. You need that spoonful of sugar to start the deep dive.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's I had my younger sister. She got involved by listening to bands like Shelter and things that were a little bit more poppy before she kind of continued on to the Madballs and Warzone and stuff like that.
And what did you listen to before that Deep Purple kind of opened your minds sonically? Were you
So I mean, the only thing I could listen to back then was whatever was on the radio. I mean, I remember like Huey Lewis and the News being something that I was familiar with as a 10-year-old, but I wasn't like a music fan because the only music I heard was what was playing, in my mom's car when we were driving around running errands.
Right.
And stuff that was maybe on the radio, but it was just, I was at the mercy of whatever was being played. So to have that record from my cousin, that was a good first step. And then I remember I had braces when I was, 10 or 11, and I would go every time I went to the orthodontist, they'd give you a little, if you had a good appointment, they'd check this card. And after you got 10 checks, you got to bring it to Uncle Jim's record, stop or something in our town. Oh. And I remember, so the second piece of like physical media that I had was Motley Crue, Girls, Girls, Girls. And I don't remember what drew me to it at the time, but maybe I had seen something on TV or like in a magazine. A lot of times when I'd be waiting for my mom, if she was at like the local pharmacy, if we were running errands, I'd sit there and look at magazines. And I remember, for whatever reason, Motley Crue was on my radar. So I was, in 6th grade and like rocking out to Motley Crue and like, living in the suburbs. That was a much faster kind of worldview, I think. Things moved a lot faster according to the way, they saw it. So I think that was another step for me getting into more aggressive music.
Oh, yeah. And especially because like their image was so like immediately like eye-catching, like even if you hated Motley Crue, like you can't help but deny that they have a very unique look. And I always thought their early stuff, I know they're considered more of a glam metal band, but I always thought their early stuff, like, Your Live Wires or like Too Fast for Love, was like very still in that sort of like glam punk. Like they sound like they like just wanted to amp up like some of the like even like the UK bands like Slade and stuff like that.
Sure.
Okay, and so what? And so this is happening. What years is this happening? I want to get a sense of what would be on the radio at the time.
This is probably 87, 88, probably. And I went from Motley Crue very quickly to Metallica, and then I think I got the Injustice for All album, when it came out, and then it went into the Roadrunner catalog, so very quickly into a lot of death metal. I think I was, Sepultura, Obituary, Deicide, things like that. So for a year or two, I was really just into very extreme, kind of death metal at that time. And maybe within a year or two after that, so probably around 92, I was, I think, maybe a sophomore in high school.
Okay.
junior in high school maybe, I was like, you know what? I'm only going to listen to hardcore from now on.
Uh-huh.
I'm not. I mean, I was listening to hardcore bands, and it was kind of a mix. But for whatever reason, I think I just got tired of the Demons and Armageddon, kind of
Sure.
subject matter.
Yeah.
And I think I was identifying more with stuff that hardcore bands were singing about.
Kind of, yeah, that's sort of like the lyrical content. Yeah, because like metal is cool when you're a kid, and I do agree. Like once you get a little over, you outgrow the sort of like Dungeons and Dragons kind of imagery. Like
Yeah.
Holy Diver slaps, but yeah, once you are looking, I guess, for something a little more authentic, or maybe something that speaks to kind of the feelings you're having if you're like slightly alienated kind of teenager. I don't know if you were, but
For sure.
and
Yeah.
and especially like my image of a lot of hardcore punk is like probably the first time you're hearing political music, or like overtly political music that's maybe not like rah USA is great, we've never done anything wrong ever. So getting exposed to those kinds of ideas, I imagine, is kind of like certainly a pivotal moment for sure.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, I remember, and it's probably because I was, you're more closed-minded when you're in your teens, and you think
Mhm.
what's best. And I was just like, I'm only going to listen to this from now on. So there's metal records that have come out in the early to mid '90s since that I never heard, which I actually went back and started to revisit some of these bands' catalogs after I had kind of sworn off metal in the years, that much later, I guess. But
Well, it seems like it might have stuck with you because some of the bands on Bridge 9, the more like heavier bands, I feel like there's that sort of undercurrent of a lot of them, like You're Against Authorities and Crimes and Stereos, that sort of maybe go slightly more metal tinged. Like we're waving to the neighborhood of metal over where it is, but we're still firmly on like the punk side. So I feel like maybe that influence kind of stuck in and grew with your business.
I think a lot of the bands that I've worked with probably had a similar background as I did.
Yeah.
Maybe got into hardcore and punk through metal.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these people have a soft spot when they're writing songs.
Oh, totally. And when you're growing up and discovering all this stuff, this is in Boston specifically, where you grew
No,
up?
so this would have been Central Connecticut.
Central Connecticut.
Till about 1994. I was in Central Connecticut till 94. I went to college in Vermont from 94 to 98.
Okay.
So during the school year, I was in Vermont. I was in Connecticut on holidays and summers, and then moved to Boston in 98.
Gotcha. So still very proper New England credentials for sure.
Yeah, all New England.
Right on. So, and this part of Connecticut, what was this area of Connecticut you were like? Because I've also found like there's a certain punk need to sort of rebel against comfortable surroundings. So I don't know if that's what this part of Connecticut was like, but that's what.
Yeah. So I grew up in Glastonbury, Connecticut. It's in Hartford County. So it's a good town, like 99.9% of the kids go on to college. So it's not an urban environment at all. But it was a breeding ground for a lot of hardcore kids, and a lot of the people from my town and that were in my high school at the time that I was there all went on to start bands, do labels. I mean, there was probably a few different cities around Connecticut in the mid 90s that had really active scenes, and for whatever reason, Glastonbury, Connecticut was one of them.
Fascinating. Yeah, kind of sort of like we need to create something for us to do almost.
Yeah, I think we just had a bunch of people that were very DIY and that wanted to, there was at least 3 record labels that came out of Glastonbury. 2 of them did, maybe put out a half dozen records and then kind of called it quits. But, around the same time in that kind of mid to late 90s, we were all, doing our thing.
Very, very cool. And was there ever a point where you were going to be in a band or wanted to be in a band before Bridge 9 became an idea, or was that never going to be something that you were interested in?
No. So, not that I wasn't interested, but I had attention deficit, issues growing up. And so I never had I never took the time to really learn an instrument. I didn't see myself, or maybe I didn't have the confidence, I think, to be the front person of a band.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of my friends were in bands, so I started the label as an effort to stay involved and be,
Yeah.
they're writing the records. I'm going to help them put them out.
Fantastic. So basically, like, you're a fan. I want to be involved. What can I do? I can do this. And you were 19. I thought I was doing a little research. You were 19 when Bridge Nine started.
Yeah, so I was 19, sophomore in college. Again, I was living 2 states away from where I'd grown up, 3 hours away. I felt a little disconnected because I was in a small town going to college, and I know there was a scene up there, but I wasn't yet introduced to it or familiar with it or comfortable. So I wanted to do something that would continue to kind of get me heading back to go see bands play in Connecticut, give me a little extra reason to be more involved. And putting out that first record at the time was the kind of like the impetus for that.
Gotcha. And like, where were you going to see bands play in this area? I imagine if this is kind of more like a slightly upper middle class neighborhood and this strong DIY presence, are people like putting on shows in like DIY spaces? Is there a venue that these shows kind of centered around?
So when I was in high school in Connecticut, we would go to, there was actually quite a few venues that would have regular hardcore shows, whether it was the Tune-In in New Haven, Connecticut, or the Sports Palace in New Britain. There were, and there would be the VFW halls here and there. There was Studio 158 in Willimantic, Connecticut, that had a lot of DIY shows. Not so much backyards and basements, but there was always something going on in different parts of the state, because whether it was the New Britain area or the New Haven area or West Hartford, there was always something going on. But also, we were really close to Providence, Rhode Island. We were not that far from the Northampton, kind of Western Mass area. So oftentimes we would go see a band play in Providence, play somewhere in Connecticut, and then go see them again in kind of Western Massachusetts.
Oh, nice. You could, you can kind of hit those like three. It sounds so douchey to say those three markets in pretty quick succession.
Kind of like a weekend tour,
Yeah, absolutely. Which, from a lot of my friends that I know that are in bands now, that's when you're at a certain level, that's the conventional touring wisdom. It doesn't make too much sense nowadays to like get in the van and go out for like 2-week stretches when you don't have an audience. It makes much more sense to like pick 3 cities that you can get to in a weekend, find bands in those cities, and then do a show, and then schedule shows like Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Well, rad. And okay. So, all right. So, 19, you're gonna put this record out. And what was the Bridge Nine's first release?
So it was a split 7-inch with 2 Connecticut bands. The first one was a band called Tenfold, and they were from my high school. So members, I think like three of the members went to my high school. They were a couple of years younger than I was. I think they might have either been seniors when I was talking to them and up in my college about doing the record, or recently kind of moved on. But we just did a split single because they had just kicked their singer out of the band. The guitarist moved over to vocals. They wanted to put something out so that people could hear not necessarily the new sound, but like the new vocalist. And didn't want to maybe commit to a full EP just yet.
Right.
So they picked friends of theirs that I met through them, this band, Sum of All Fears, and they were kind of doing stuff at the same time as Tenfold.
Gotcha. So that's what and they came to you, or you came to them?
So I went to Tenfold and said, I want to put out a record. Is this something you guys would be into? They had just self-released their own record on their bass player's label. So their bass player is this guy Jesse, and he had a label called Stand Hard Records, and he was in Tenfold, and then later went on to form the band Right Brigade and was in American Nightmare as well. Okay. So he was very active in doing stuff, and had put out a handful of records at that time. And I think he didn't want to do another record, so they're like, yeah, if you want to do it, that's cool.
Very cool. So that was kind of like you're in with this opportunity. So you're 19, and what did you go to college for? Did you study like the music business or business?
No, not music business or business at all. It was fine arts. So I was painting, sculpting,
Mm-hmm.
graphic designing. Um, you know, in hindsight, I wish I'd taken a few business classes, but it
Right.
was strictly art.
Right. Well, I'm the same way. I was a theater major. That was what I studied. I also minored in film, which is kind of like the nexus for all the creative things I do. So I relate as well. I've had to learn kind of the business side as I've gotten older. So you're doing okay. So you're doing this split, and brand new to this record label. No sense of the economics of record labels. So what was that process like? What was like the first impetus? What was the first thing you thought like, okay, how do I get the money to fund this? What was that process of putting that single out as a new label?
So when you decide you want to do something like put out a record, I wasn't even thinking of necessarily starting a label. It was just I want to make this one record, and I knew a couple people that had done it or were in the process of doing it. So there were other people that I could kind of pick their brains. I was very fortunate because friends of mine that I went to college with knew somebody that had put out a bunch of records. It
Mm-hmm.
was this gentleman named Scott Bybin, and he had a label called Bloodlink Records, and in the '90s had put out a bunch of stuff. And I had a few of his records in my collection, so they gave me his cell phone number, or not. Sorry, this is actually before a cell phone. So he gave me his landline number
Uh huh.
because this is probably '95, and and I called him out of the blue, which was common back then because people would advertise either their home phone number or their mailing address, and you would just get random letters or random phone calls. If you were trying to book a tour or if you were promoting something, your number would be out there, and then some random person in a random city would call you. And so he wasn't surprised to hear from me, but we had never met. And I just said, hey, our mutual friend Mark said to give you a call. I want to put out a record. What do I do? And he was actually quite patient with me, gave me a bunch of tips and things like where to press the record, phone numbers, who to ask for, the kind of print shops that you can use for certain things that you're going
Mm-hmm.
to need. So it was just some minor details, but I think most importantly, after I got off the phone with him, I was like, okay, this is something I can wrap my head around because before it was like this, it was just this idea that really had no shape to it.
Yeah.
So I was kind of able to narrow it down and be like, okay, this is something that I could do.
Gotcha. Is there a specific piece of advice that he gave you that really stood out when after that phone call?
Not necessarily. I think it was just gathering information because back then it was much harder, right? I mean, this is pre-internet. If you want to find something out and learn something, you have to go find that information, and it's not as easily accessible. And there were no classes for how to start a record label. There
Right.
were some random, books, surprisingly, but they weren't really written from a perspective that applied to what I was trying to do or made sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
So you just really had to find people that were already doing it. I think I've used the metaphor of like tattooing as an example. If you want to become a tattoo artist, you don't just go to tattoo school. I mean, I don't know, maybe that exists now, but when I was coming up, you had to be an apprentice and find someone that was willing to teach you. And if they didn't want to teach you, you're not learning. But you have to find someone. And for me, as somebody that wanted to do the label, I had to kind of seek out other people that were doing it and just ask them questions. Thankfully, sharing information was usually something that people were willing to do.
Yeah, it's almost like going to trade school in a way. Like you sort of like if you wanted to be a blacksmith, I guess, or like a mechanic, like that's how you do it as opposed to just like you learn by doing it essentially. But that's and to your point, like the idea of like the scene, I feel like this particular scene has always been like very supportive and of each other or bringing people in with like the right intentions and the right passions, to so that there's more music to exist, there's more shows to see.
I remember in the in the 90s, I think Maximum Rock and Roll they'd do a book or like almost a zine that was called Book Your Own Fucking Life.
Oh, I know about Book Your Own Fucking Life.
Yeah, a lot of people use that as like a starting point, whether it was to book tours or to like kind of get whatever it was they were trying to do going. And I think that early on people recognize if this subculture and this scene is going to continue to thrive, you need to bring in new blood. And it needs to be people that were brought in not because they were born into the coolest pedigree of hardcore punk, but because that they were interested and they stumbled upon it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I've thought about. I think you're totally dead on. That's something I've thought about a lot with jazz, about how jazz was like the cool kids music for a certain era of American history, and it was like the predominant popular music. And now it has gone almost completely niche. Like it is such a tiny size compared to where it was in pop culture. And I feel like a part of that is contributed to cool kid syndrome. Like it just got to
just gatekeeping.
Yeah, exactly. 100% gatekeeping. Like if you're too like off-putting to anyone else who's like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like I was saying earlier, like the what's punk and what's not punk arguments. None of that even terribly relevant anymore, I don't think. It's just like, are you cool? Do you want to make cool music? Well, come on in. That's the parameter. And how did that first single do?
It did well. It was both bands were making, getting a lot of interest at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It still took a while for me to sell them all. I think I pressed 1,000 records, and it was maybe a year at least to sell them. One of the first things that I did was my friend Jesse, who had started his label maybe 6 months before I did. I remember going to his house and going through all of his fanzines and looking for distros that had advertisements in it, and we would call the phone number or mail a copy. In most places, if you mailed them a copy of the record with what's called like a one sheet, it has like all the basic info for what that record is and who's in the band and how many songs. We would send them to all the little distros back then and try and sell them, and it would take sometimes 6 months to get paid if they sold. A lot of times distribution back then it came in the form of trading records with other people that were doing labels in other parts of the country and other countries. So I would send 10 copies of the record I pressed to somebody in Sweden, and then they would send me 10 copies of their record, or if they had 2 records, 5 of each. And then I would go and set up a little merch table at shows, and I would have my 15 or 20 different 7-inches, because I only put out one, but I was trading it with other people. So the Tenfold record that I was putting out was now on some merch table in Arkansas and some random place in North Carolina and in France.
Yeah, like the pre-internet distribution, like back then, like when you wanted to hear something new, it was like an effort if you couldn't get it in a big store. And how did you handle international distribution?
So there was a couple big international distributors. I think back then Green Hell was a big one. And so you'd get in touch with them, and if you were lucky, if you were able to say like, oh well, this is for fans of, and then name 3 more popular, bigger hardcore bands, and they took it. Maybe they take 50 copies and they would put it in their catalog over there, and the catalog would get spread all over Europe, and then you'd sell some records, and hopefully within a couple of months they'd come back and say, yeah, send us 20 more or something. And back then, a flat rate envelope was pretty cheap. You'd pack as many 7-inches as you could into it and then mail it over there.
Amazing. I love hearing about this stuff. Like this era, I wish I could have been more. I wish I was not a kid during this era, because I feel like I could have really thrived
It was fun. I remember being in college and I was writing letters to people everywhere, because what I did was I put a couple of ads in, I remember one of them was in the Victory Records catalog.
Uh-huh.
And Victory Records their catalog was distributed everywhere. So literally anyone that liked anything kind of hardcore and punk got a copy of this catalog at some point in the mid-90s. So I had this tiny little, like 1/6 of the page ad in it, and it had this anime straight edge design that ended up becoming very popular at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a little thing that said send $1 for a sticker and a catalog. And the catalog for me was one photocopied page with the stickers and like the 1 or 2 records that I had and a couple t-shirt designs. And I just photocopied them as many as I needed. And then every week I would just go to the post office with envelopes that had a sticker wrapped inside one of these catalogs and mail them out to people. And they would mail me, the $1 with a note, or sometimes they'd send you a letter and tell you about themselves. Like, hey, I'm like, Joe from Georgia, and there's nobody that's into punk near, here, and I saw your sticker and I wanted one. So like, here's $1, blah, 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 which was very cool. And then you get kids in Europe that would write you letters, and almost always what they would do, because postage even then, I mean, it was an expensive thing. And kids from Europe would take, I think it was glue sticks,
Mm-hmm.
and put glue stick over their stamps before they would mail you their dollar or whatever, and then like wrapped in thing. And then basically that would allow you to remove the postage mark off the stamp. And they would ask you, like it happened all the time, they would ask you to cut the stamps off their envelope and mail them back to them so that they could reuse them again.
Wow.
So it was just like this hack for kids in Europe, where it was expensive to mail order from the States to kind of like make it a little easier.
Amazing. That shows like such well, I love that I love everything about that. That's real ingenuity. That I had never heard of that before. And then how soon after your first couple singles did Bridge 9 become officially your label and a label?
So I put out one record in 96, one in 97, 2 from Boston area bands in 98, because at that point I was still living in Vermont, but I was traveling to Boston quite a bit to go to shows. And so I put out 2 records with Boston area bands. One of them I released an album for on CD in 99, but it wasn't until the summer of 2000, really, I think maybe the spring of 2000, I had 2 records that kind of gained a national attention. The first was another split. It was with that band Right Brigade that my friend Jesse, who had been in Tenfold, was now singing for, and this band Poor Excuse from Boston. Does a little bit more on the punk tip. But that came out in the spring of 2000, and then the one that made the most noise was American Nightmare, and that came out in the summer of 2000. So, and those were the first 2 bands. Actually, I think Right Brigade didn't really tour a lot, but for whatever reason, there was a lot of interest nationally, so I was getting mail orders for the record from people all over the place. But with American Nightmare, they were the first band that was willing to tour pretty much anywhere.
Awesome. Very cool. Very cool. This is fascinating to me as someone who's been on kind of like the other side, like looking in on how these businesses, the music business works. This is all really, really interesting to me. So and the idea that's unusual too. So like you had this one band who this album there was a lot of demand for, but they didn't tour much. But then I imagine there's also the band that's willing to tour a lot. At that time was generating like a lot of interest, so it was probably helping with sales as well.
Yeah, and just building awareness. I mean, they became ambassadors for the label. So, and at that time, I was really ramping up what I was doing, because prior to American Nightmare, the main job of a label, as I kind of saw it, was to press the record, and then I would say press 1,000 records. I would take maybe 150 copies and give it to the band, and then that was their copies. They sold them and kept the money, and that was kind of their cut. With American Nightmare, but I didn't really do much else. I mean, I took out some small ads here and there, but nothing crazy. With American Nightmare, I started doing all sorts of much more involved advertising. So, we were taking out actual magazine ads and very extensive fanzine ads. So, where with like Tenfold, if I had put an ad in maybe 3 fanzines, and one catalog, now with American Nightmare, it was like 20. So I was trying to build awareness for them, and I think bands saw all the opportunities that American Nightmare had and all of the awareness that I was doing as a label, and wanted. I think it was an opportunity for me to find people that wanted similar treatment.
Right, like they saw what you were doing for them and thought, this is somebody that I would want to work with. He seems like the real deal, and I talking to you, I feel I can definitely tell that you are, especially compared to like the like major label system where like artists like lose even more control over most aspects of the record. So that was something. So that was something that kind of like drew bands to you. So I imagine at a certain point, probably still now, you get inundated with like a lot of bands that want to be signed or want to be on Bridge 9. What do you, when you're looking at bands, or like what do you look for in terms of this is a group I want to work with? Like what does that decision making process look like for you?
So for me, when I'm looking at a band, obviously the first most important aspect is I have to like the band. It has to be music that I enjoy, or that I think has, that I think is cool. But you also want a band that's going to work hard, because there are very talented bands that are lazy. And just because you have like the most technically proficient band doesn't mean they're really going to go as far as they could go and realize whatever their potential could be. So you really need to find bands that are willing to hustle and will match that. So if you're busting your ass, we're going to bust our ass. If we find that a band is kind of, they're just kind of dialing it in, well, we're going to do what we can, but we're going to maybe not spend as much money on ads, because we know they're not going to tour as much. And if they're not touring as much, they're not going to sell as many records. And if we don't sell as many records, then we don't have the ability to cover the ads.
Right. And is that what a work ethic in a band looks like to you, like constant touring?
We don't demand constant touring, but it certainly helps, right? If you're just sitting at home, you're not selling records, you're not building awareness, and people are not connecting with you as an artist. Because when you're out there singing to somebody face to face, there is a different connection that they have with you than if they're just listening to you on Spotify. So it is important, I think, for artists to go and bands to go and have those relationships with other bands and other scenes and other people that are actively doing things, but then also with the people that are the fans and people that are there just excited about the music.
Yeah, that's that untangible thing that streaming numbers, I think, can't quantify, is that live connection. Because how many I'm blanking right now, but I definitely remember there was this one tour, pretty established hardcore band, pretty long history of live shows and good live shows, and then they had like an up and coming like kind of Ghost Main-esque kind of like trap rapper. Again, huge numbers on Spotify, hasn't played a ton of live shows, so sort of like the idea of like the combination of those two was like a smart idea, because
nice.
Fascinating. So yeah, but yeah, absolutely. You got to work with music that you like, for sure.
Yeah. And we still work with bands that aren't able to tour as much, but we just, we understand what our expectations are going into it.
Gotcha. If there was something you could tell bands, or even people who are wanting to start bands, something that would make their lives a lot easier as far as like getting on the radar of labels, or even like maybe tour booking agents or managers, what would that thing be?
So the bands that usually have the most opportunities are the ones that are the most DIY and the most active themselves in their local scenes. So, you can't just start a band in some random part of the country and expect to get on the radar of an established label, especially if they're not in your city. Right. So for us, the first bands that I signed, originally were just my friends. They were people that I either went to high school with, or people that I lived with, or people that were in the neighborhood, and with respect to where I lived in Boston. And then after that, it was the bands that I met when I was on the road with them. So I'd go on tour with bands, and I would meet other people, and you have these personal experiences with them. You go and it's a bonding opportunity, right? You're touring in Europe. I remember I went with American Nightmare on their first European tour in 2001, and they had this band Reaching Forward that was this Dutch straight edge band over there. And we hung out with them for 3 weeks, and they were cool guys. And they had never done anything over in the States yet, but we released their album that they had already put out in Europe. We released it in the United States. We helped them tour over here and come here for the first time. So, that's a band that never would have come out on Bridge 9 had I not been there and gone and had this personal experience with them. So I think for bands that are looking to, if you want to be on a bigger label and you want to do something, especially if it's not in your hometown where you have a personal connection with whoever it is behind the scenes, you need to create reasons for someone to want to vouch for you and to help you. And some of the bands that I know, bands that have had people that booked shows locally, that's usually a great opportunity. So, if you want to meet touring bands and have people come through, book their shows. Anyone can do it. It's the book your own fucking life thing. Like, if there's nobody booking the kind of hardcore shows that you like in your town, start doing it. Rent a VFW hall, make connections, do something very grassroots at first, and then create an opportunity for people to want to come to your city. And then you're going to start to have, you'll build relationships with people that that could potentially, you could work with down the road, whether it's so after I was touring with bands and meeting bands on the road and signing them, then the next wave of bands that I worked with were from bands that my bands were touring with. So I as the label grew and I had more responsibilities, I wasn't able to go out on the road as often as I wanted to. So I would have bands that would come to me that I was working with and releasing albums for, and they'd say, hey, every time we go to the Northwest, we play with this, this band plays a few shows with us, and the response is crazy, you should check them out. Or hey, we just toured for the last 3 weeks with this band from San Diego, and they have a split 7-inch out, but they're really looking to do something bigger, and we're going to take them on tour, so you should check them out. So there's always one degree of separation between the releases that we were working with and then usually somebody else that we had a connection to. There's very few records that we've released that are completely random. Almost, of the 300 or so releases that Bridge 9 has had, there is some 6 degrees of separation. And it's because it's hard to just, as an independent label, you have very limited resources, whether it's time or money or whatever. And so you need to find bands that either, other people can vouch for, or that there's a connection to. And I find if you work with bands that are friends, it kind of, the rising tide lifts all boats scenario. So, I don't want to just sign random bands. I want to work with a scene almost. I want to work with multiple artists, even if they're not from the same city, that are either have something in common. And I found that has been successful for Bridge 9 to have that sense of community.
Absolutely. And and it's grows out of people building their own communities. And I think I saw another review, you're creating your own opportunities. Truly the ethos of punk all along is DIY till I die, right?
When you're trying to establish yourself, whether for me as a label or for somebody else as a band, you need to give a reason for people to care or to connect with you. And, some people find it by booking shows and giving bands chances to come in and play in their towns. For me, early on, I did a newsletter where I was promoting local bands and local shows, and I would print a couple thousand copies of this newsletter every month, and I would go and hand them out at shows. So it connected me with people by physically handing them to people as they left a show, right? So like, last band's on, oh, we got 2 more songs. Okay, I got my backpack. I'm going to go over by the front door. And as people are leaving, I'm just like this, handing this newsletter. And again, it wasn't pre-internet, but it was a lot of this information being easily accessible on the internet. So, it gave you one place where it had all the upcoming shows in the area for the next month. And then it also had a 20 questions section with a local band member or someone that did a label. And then the cover of it was just a brief interview with a band from the Boston area. So, I'm having a connection with fans and people that are into it, that are taking it from me, but that I'm also, it's giving me a reason to approach people that were in bands that I liked, that I didn't have maybe any connection to. So instead of me just being like, hey, like I like your band, it was me going to them and saying, hey, I want to talk to you about your band, and I'm going to publish it on this newsletter, which wasn't a heavy lift for me. I mean, I was using a free photocopier at work, and it was a few hours of me like doing my very basic graphic design to make it. But then, now I was somebody that was helping this person, and so now they knew who I was. And when you're new to a city, like I was when I first moved to Boston, I moved in 98, and the first issue of this newsletter came out in, I think, February of 99. So within, I think it was like 7 months of moving there, I started this, and I did it every month for a year. And it was an opportunity to just to meet people.
That's really cool, man. That's giving me a ton of ideas that I'm probably I want to incorporate into all the things I do. That's really insightful. Like, how many people have that gusto to just go and do that? That's rad.
Well, it's difficult to just approach people, right? When you don't, especially if you don't have any sort of social capital. Like, I was somebody that nobody knew. I'd put out a few records, but it didn't, who cares? A lot of people had put out a few records at that time, just random 7-inch labels. And so I was somebody that was new, that just wanted an opportunity to talk with people. And I can sometimes be socially awkward. And there's definitely been times where, I think I've given people the wrong vibe because I'm not, I for whatever reason, like I'm staying to myself. But it's not because I don't want to talk to people. Sometimes, you just don't, I don't know, you're not comfortable. And so this was an opportunity for me to kind of push myself and kind of force me to engage with people that that were like in cool bands and were doing things that, were like above, like I guess levels above me, because I was just like a fan and they were doing cool shit. So
fuck yeah, dude. And so I'm also curious, how do you translate, how has this ethos translated? And you said Bridge Giants put out over 309 records now?
Over 300-ish, yeah.
That's incredible, Chris. And so my question to you now is, how does this sort of attitude and these ethos that you learned in the mid 90s, early 2000s, how does this translate? How do you translate this into the music industry of 2023, where physical media is a smaller subsect of the overall pie, and we're moving mostly to streaming? How do you translate that into the current age?
Well, so I mean, it is a much more exciting time, I think, right now than it was, because before, the only way as a label that you could have any sales, was you had to physically have these records in house, right? So you had to have the records pressed, you had to have the CDs, and you had to move them all around, and you had to ship them to distributors, and they had to be able to get to people. And if you ran out of press of something, it was no longer generating any revenue. It was dead, basically. Right. And with records, it's and physical media, it's hard because you might press 1,000 records and sell them very quickly. But let's say there's like 1,200 people that really want this record, and you just sold out 1,000 of them, and you're like, wow, that was awesome. I'm gonna make another 1,000, and then you make 1,000 more records, and then you sell 200 of them very quickly, and then you've got 800 copies just chilling. And that,
Right.
We dealt with that, and I think a lot of labels deal with that. So it's hard to balance that. You end up having a warehouse full of stuff, which we did years ago, and we kind of scaled that down. And then with digital music and streaming, streaming music, it's really been exciting because when Bridge 9 started really getting its legs under itself, that was early 2000s, and that was literally the bottom of the music industry. It had just bottomed out, and it was very difficult to make money as a label and to generate revenue as a label and as a business. And so like that was our baseline, and that's just how I existed, and that's what I knew. So it could only get better, and thankfully it did, because with streaming, now all of a sudden, I think for the first time, like a few years ago, it was like the first time where sales were and opportunity as a label was growing, because it used to be all the way up here, and then it just shit the bed, and then it started to go up. So now it's actually exciting because there are more opportunities for a label to be able to support itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to me because not only is streaming the predominant way, but somehow like vinyl, like the oldest way, like we've cut out CDs and cassettes, but vinyl has still continued to be a big seller for like friends. Like I have a friend like Jean Jacket Enamel Pins, a big vinyl guy.
Yep.
So there's almost these kind of like dual, like the future and then like the very specific part of the past that are revenue streams for artists and for labels now.
Well, for whatever reason, vinyl, I mean, I remember when I was pressing my first singles, I was using a pressing plant in Nashville, Tennessee, and I remember in the mid-90s they had I think they said they had 16 employees. And this was a mega vinyl place in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as vinyl fell out of favor with mainstream music fans, the only thing that was really keeping the lights on for these pressing plants was hip hop and hardcore and punk. And prior to all this happening, I mean, there was a pressing plant in almost every city, in a lot of cities, and now there was only a handful around the country. So, but we could still turn a record around in a month if you wanted to in the 90s, and in the last couple of years, it's gotten to the point where some pressing plants are taking a year to turn around vinyl, because there's just such unprecedented, not unprecedented, but like there's just so much demand, and a lot of these pressing plants have been kind of building up their ability to keep up with it. And so now you have new pressing plants open. I mean, there was I could count on one hand how many pressing plants that were on my radar in 1996, 1997, and now there's dozens of them. And so while that's good because it's helping meet some of the demand, and competition's good, hopefully keep some of the prices in check.
Right.
But it has been tough to turn a record around. If you're a 19-year-old kid and you want to press a 7-inch, these days, it might take you 8 months or a year to turn that record around. I had a pressing plant that wasn't accepting new customers anymore. They were just only pressing for their existing clients. And so if you are new and you want to get started, it was tough. So that's actually why you are seeing some people doing cassettes now, because you can still do fun colors. You can do 100 on a purple tape, and 100 on a yellow tape, like you do with vinyl. But you can turn it around in a month.
You're absolutely right. I started seeing in Bushwick and like Williamsburg, like the cool kids area of Brooklyn, that cassettes were coming back, and I was like, how? Do these kids even have anything that could play a cassette on? Or it might not even really matter. You might just have the QR code with the Spotify link, but it's like a physical, tangible thing. That really interests me. Thank you for explaining that. I'd also heard, and I don't know if, I'm actually curious about two things here. First off, I heard that Adele's had an album that, because of the vinyl pressing for that, delayed everybody else getting their vinyl pressed for a while, with Adele's most recent record.
Yeah, and I saw a lot of them, and I saw photos of bargain bins and I don't know, Savers, thrift stores.
Yeah, like Goodwill and stuff. Yeah,
Goodwill. In my experience before that, it wasn't because I was dealing with a pressing plant in Nashville, Tennessee. So they would always say, don't press a record around the 5th anniversary of Elvis's birth or his death, because that's when all the reissues were getting ordered by people that had Elvis, intellectual property. So that would jam up all the pressing plants for a month before and a month after. Then it became record store day stuff. If there were so many record store releases that were being put in for specifically for that one window in April, that it was blocking out the ability to press a record. So it was, there's been times where production has been difficult because of either a Taylor Swift record or an Adele record, or because of, a big anniversary or something like Record Store Day.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I imagine because we're coming up, there's probably going to be some Michael Jackson anniversaries in the next couple of years, I would imagine. Or Beyonce will probably surprise drop a box set that we didn't know about.
Yeah.
Well, that's wild. I'd also heard, and I've seen this as well because I know you've traveled a little bit. Have you ever been to Japan by any chance?
I have. Not in 20 years, but I have.
So I was there within the last 7 years. I was actually there for my 30th birthday, which is 7 years ago now. Oh my God. But I was amazed to see a Tower Records. And I went in there and just bought up the entire J-Punk section. But it really amazed me that CDs are still big in Japan.
And CDs always have been. I remember even when we were focusing more on vinyl in the early 2000s and into 2010s, what have you, for whatever reason, Japanese stores weren't as interested in vinyl as they were with CDs. And I had heard part of that was because living quarters are so small in some of the more urban areas.
I could see that.
People didn't collect vinyl because it just took up too much space. So that might have been part of it.
Yeah, that I could definitely see that. Yeah, because some of those super tiny Tokyo apartments, they're 600 square feet or something like that. Fascinating. Well, I know we're coming up on time here. There's a few more things I'd love to ask you.
Cool.
I really appreciate your time, Chris.
No, I'm happy to.
Well, first off, I'm curious. What's on the release calendar for Bridge 9 that you're really excited about?
So we just finally got vinyl in, our first new vinyl release in a little bit, with this band Roll Call from New York City. Those actually just arrived last week, so I'm excited about that. We have a new band that we're announcing soon. We haven't announced it yet, but within the month or so we'll be announcing. That's kind of more on it's a new artist, a band that is more on the kind of Defeater, Have Heart, Polar Bear Club kind of side of the spectrum. And interestingly enough, they're actually one of maybe a handful of bands that we've ever worked with that there is no connection. They actually came to our record store, one of the members, and after we were just talking music, mentioned hey, could I send you my demo? And it was great. So that was a very rare. They didn't come to us having multiple connections in between us. So excited about that. But yeah, I mean, we're as a label, we are continually we're still looking to sign new bands and continue to put out new records. We're probably scaling it back a little bit, stepping up from where we've been the last couple of years. But I don't think we're going to be the label that puts out 20 new albums a year like we used to at one point. That is a very hard to sustain effort. But we're we opened our own record store in Beverly, just 30 minutes north of Boston. So we're super excited about that.
Cool.
We want to kind of have that be part of what defines Bridge 9 now, beyond just putting out records. So we also don't want to be a catalog label, so we're going to continue to find new bands and put out new things. But we also want to kind of nurture a sense of community around what we're doing here and not just exist in a warehouse or on the internet.
Very cool. I like that idea very much so. Like a way to continue to be creative and in a way that honors everybody that you're working with, as well as gives you time for your for yourself as well. And I will next time I'm in the Boston area because I love Boston. I'll probably be spending some money
Well,
in your place.
please come up here. We are one town over from Salem, so we get a lot of people that come to kind of do the Salem tourism, and then we're literally five minutes down the road. So it's a good spot.
Oh, nice. Oh, all the people who come in for like the witch trial stuff.
Yep.
Ah, right on. Well, I usually go up to Boston because my favorite cider brewery is in Boston,
Nice.
down east. Which I don't know if this is a real thing, but people are telling me East Boston is a neighborhood now, and it seems like a real estate thing that they made up. But that's where it is. And
It
I really
might be. I mean, I know East Boston was probably a little bit, more rough around the edges at one point. I'm sure they've kind of, much like everything in the Boston area has gentrified and has made it cool and has high priced condos. I don't know them or have any connection to them, but I know there's a cider place in Salem called Far From the Tree that people seem to really like. So worth checking out if you're a cider guy.
Far From the Tree. I'm writing that down. One other thing I'd love to ask you, and I mean this in good fun, because I know you have a couple of other businesses as well, and I know you've also like one of the most New York hardcore bands, H2O, is on your label.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of like fuck the Red Sox, fuck the Yankees, New York sports rivalry. I imagine that's all in good fun, but what's that? How does that play out when you're like going between scenes and with bands and in sports? Is there like some good natured ribbing that happens with those guys?
For sure. Yeah, I mean it's for sure good natured. It's funny because as a label, so our origin story was and that we were able to kind of fundraise to put out the records that we did early on because we were selling Yankee Suck merchandise outside of Fenway Park. So, friends of mine and I would go to Fenway and sell bumper stickers and T-shirts that, kind of talked shit on the Yankees and Yankees fans, and ended up making a lot of money doing it. And that's what allowed us to go from putting out one record a year or two a year to like 15 or 20. So it was a huge kind of infusion of resources and funds into the label. And within a couple of years realized, wait, this is actually a better business than putting out punk records. So I started a second business and under the name Sully's, and it is like a kind of Boston-centric clothing, brand. We don't really riff on the rivalry with the Yankees like we used to. Every once in a while, a little bit, but that was more of like a all the way up until the 2000s, kind of thing. But we found that in the years since, I think we've put out, even though we're a Boston label, we've put out more records with New York bands, which is somewhat ironic because they've inevitably, in some way or some shape, benefited from the Yankee Suck money going into their bands.
So that's a fun full circle moment. That's awesome, man. I hadn't seen anything because I follow American soccer, like Major League Soccer, and it's always, every time I've been in Boston, it's always hard to find something for the Revolution.
I've heard that quite a few times from people.
Yeah, because that's like the souvenir. That's like the souvenir, like the scarf or the jersey. I'm looking for. I will say though, because I like New York City. We tend to hate Philly more now than any other city, especially because they beat us a lot last year.
Yeah.
But Chris, I am so happy for the album, for the music that you have put out that has enriched my life, and I'm happy for your knowledge that you've given to me. I assure you, this will not be the only time that I hit you up for art related advice, because I got a lot of stuff that I do. So I will hope that you'll be appreciative of that in the future. But thank you very much, Chris.
I am happy to, and I just want to point out to other people, like, ask those questions. If you want to do something cool, find people that are doing something cool in a similar vein or something that you're excited about, and approach them. Don't be afraid to talk to people, because that's how you're going to learn. And how this sort of thing is going to continue to evolve and get better.
100%. I think that's great advice to close out on. Chris, thank you so much again. I really appreciate this.
No problem. Well, thank you.
ask the questions to get the information that you want to get, and be a part of your local scene and your local community. Great advice that I like to remember from time to time, and I think is helpful for anyone else that would be coming up as well. Thank you, Chris, for your time and for your knowledge, and I appreciate you taking time to chat with me on the show today. Folks, I hope you enjoyed that. That is our show for today. If you enjoyed this podcast and feel like you know a friend who would be interested in listening to this podcast as well, you can send them to awesomedisaster.com. That's got links to everywhere that you can get this podcast. We are available on Apple, Stitcher, and Spotify. If you want to give us a subscribe and share some links to some episodes, that'll help us please our algorithmic overlords, and I will be tremendously appreciative. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at Comic Will Carry on Twitter, at Will Carry 23 on Instagram, at Between Awesome and Disaster, all one word on Instagram. Links also at the website as well. And you can also find, if you want to go a little bit further and support the show, find links to our Patreon as well as our merch store. Everything is available at awesomedisaster.com. If anybody else listening to this has gone to Blink's tour so far this year or is planning to, I would love to hear from you. I'm curious if you are like an elder millennial like myself, if you are younger and got into Blink from your parents. I'm curious how you got interested in my favorite band, and if you're going to the concerts this year, I would love to hear about it, and I would love to hear from you. So you can also send me a message at awesomedisaster.com as well. So thank you all again so much for being here, and I will see you next time between Awesome and Disaster. Stay safe, wear a mask, get vaccinated and boosted, and stomp out fascism. Take care, everybody.